We are with I CARE. So I CARE stands for us caring about our oceans, but also for Islamorada Conservation and Restoration Education. So Islamorada is a city down here in the Florida Keys where we are based. This is a lovely, lovely photo of our team. So this is me, I'm Aileen. I am actually not a biologist. I didn't know much about coral at all when I started working with I CARE. I was an accountant and then I started working in recreational diving. So I am super, super happy to have had this year at I CARE to learn a little bit more. Dr. Kylie Smith has her PhD in reef ecology. So obviously she is very well versed in everything we're going to be talking about today. Mike has been working down here and owns a dive shop in Islamorada, and Mackenzie has her undergraduate degree in science and in biology and is super versed in corals. So we are here to answer all of your questions as we present. But I want to ask you guys, so y'all know a little bit about coral reefs already, maybe, or we've told you that we're in the Keys, so that's a little bit of a clue, but do you guys know what the 3 largest barrier reefs are in like the entire world? Yeah, you're raising your hand, I see you.
The Florida Keys?
Florida Keys is one of them, yeah. What about some other ones that you might have heard of? Anybody? No Googling, no cheating. I know y'all are on laptops. Okay, somebody said Australia, definitely. So the Great Barrier Reef, that's actually the biggest one. So you guys have 2 out of 3, so we're gonna move right through. So the first one, the very biggest one in the entire world is the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. The second biggest barrier reef is the Mesoamerican Reef, which is kind of bordering Belize down in Central America. And then the third biggest is in the Florida Keys. So this is kind of Miami up here towards the top right of your screen. And then the Keys are this chain of islands going all the way down your screen. And those light colored parts, that's the coral reef that is protecting the Florida Keys. So that's about 275 miles of reef. And those are all protected also by the National Marine Sanctuary. So there's 2,800, that's 2,800 miles of water and reef and ecosystem and fish and all those cool critters that are protected by law in the Florida Keys. That's how important they are to us. So what is a coral reef, you guys? I'm gonna let Mackenzie start to explain a little bit of that to y'all, but does anybody have an idea what a coral is? Again, no wrong answers. Plants, animals, rocks, aliens, hand raised.
A little
Tell
bit
me.
of everything. Somebody said animal in the chat.
Okay.
Do you want like the kingdom? Do you want the kingdom it's in?
Oh,
Sure.
I know it's in the sponge kingdom. Well, the sponges go because they're one of the sponges. I do not have the exact name. I used to be very into this, and I used to know the exact name for all the kingdoms. No, I don't.
All right. So maybe anybody else have an answer? I see a hand raised over there.
Maria, I think. Did I pronounce her name right?
Okay. Me?
Yes. Yeah.
It's sort of like a sea sponge.
So kind of like a sponge. All right, Mac, tell them.
Okay, so those are all really good answers. And obviously when you guys look at the screen right here, the corals can look very different from one another. So it's really easy to get them confused. The corals are actually considered to be animals. So even though they look all really different, they all share pretty much the same foundational structures. And so the first thing you will look into is a polyp. So a polyp is basically a bunch of tentacles that surround a mouth. So if we zoom in on the tentacles, yeah, there we go. So a coral, when it first starts off, is just going to be one of those singular polyps. And then its primary goal is to just grow as fast as it can because it doesn't want to be swept off the reef or it doesn't want to be eaten by something larger. So essentially, it will do something called asexual reproduction, where it will butt itself in half and basically make a clone of itself and just keep doing that over and over again until it's like a good amount or a good size. And so if you guys look in this photo, the tentacles, you can see have all these little white dots in them. So corals are related to actually jellyfish. And we know that jellyfish can sting, and so can corals. So corals have those stinging cells in their tentacles called nematocysts. and they'll use those stinging cells to kind of capture food and any kind of particles that might be in the water column. And that is how they get about 10% of their nutrient intake and their energy. And then if we go back out, thank you, Aileen. And so where the other 90% of their energy and food comes from is something called zooxanthellae. So zooxanthellae are a type of algae that actually live within the tissue of the corals. And what they do is they're actually kind of why corals are kind of like plants, because they can photosynthesize. And so when they photosynthesize, they're providing the corals with this nutrients, and then in return, the corals are providing them a nice, safe kind of home and structure to live inside. So they have this very mutualistic relationship with one another. And the zooxanthellae is also what gives corals their nice, beautiful colors. So depending on the amount of zooxanthellae and the type is why you see all those variety of colors when you're out there on the reefs. And we'll go out. And then the last main component of corals is going to be their skeleton. So the hard corals are going to be made up of calcium carbonate, which is just a fancy word for limestone. So on the right-hand side is going to be a picture of that nice, like clean white skeleton. And then what you'll see often during the day, though, is corallite. So corallite is the specific part of the skeleton in which those polyps will actually sit in. And so during the day, because they don't need to kind of be capturing food from the water column, they'll actually have those tentacles retracted into their corallite. And this is often in that photo is what you'll see is they're just relying on those zooxanthellae to photosynthesize and give them their energy and nutrients. And that corallite, those structures is also how we identify all the different coral species, because the corallites will look very different from one another. So then we'll go into a coral colony. So these photos are all different types of corals. They have very different shapes and structures, which is why some people might think like the one in the bottom left-hand corner kind of looks like a rock. So often corals can be considered rocks. They have branching, which is going to be the one next to it. And it's kind of like a tree where it has one main base and then it branches out from there. And then there's also finger corals. So they each have their own individual base, kind of like our fingers do. And then they just grow out from there. And so if you think of those polyps, all of these corals that can have hundreds to thousands of polyps, and that is what creates a colony. And so now when the corals are a big enough size and they don't have to focus on trying to just grow as fast as they can kind of shift their focus to then becoming sexually mature. And so what corals will do is they'll kind of create these little gamete bundles that will have their egg and sperm in them. And then one time during the year, usually it's sometime after the full moon, and here in the Florida Keys is anywhere between August and October, they'll do something called broadcast spawning. So you can see in these photos, it kind of looks like there's a bunch of Dippin' Dots in the water. So that's actually their gamete bundles that they release into the water column. And those gamete bundles will then release the egg and sperm. They'll fertilize, become these little larvae, and then hopefully swim off onto another happy, healthy reef to kind of start a whole new coral colony. So we have a video that we're going to show you guys of coral spawning that was actually captured in the wild. So you can see each of those little polyps have a bundle in them. So it's coral pregnant or gravid. And then you'll be able to watch as they release all those gametes into the water column. So yeah, so it's some pretty cool stuff. We don't exactly know how the corals in the area all know when to spawn. We know it's somehow based on environmental cues, so it has to do with the tides and also the lunar cycle, but it's a very neat phenomenon. And if you're a scientist studying this, you pretty much have to become nocturnal in order to try to capture this out in the wild. It's definitely on my bucket list to do, so I will be turning nocturnal for a portion of my life to capture this. Okay, and we'll go next. Yeah, it's definitely something really cool. If you get a chance to try and go out there and see that, I definitely take that chance.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to turn it back to Aileen.
So that's what like the individual corals and the individual coral colonies, which are the animals that are living on the reef, are. So those guys are the whole reason why you have a reef. Is that a hand raised? What's that, Maria? We're sister of Maria.
What was
Just say that you're eating dinner, that's why.
what was that zoo? What I can't. I just I want to ask a question, but I forgot that word. Zathani?
Zooxanthellae.
Zooxanthellae.
Yeah, but how come when the coral have zooxanthellae, when it produces the color, how come it produces the color depending on how much it has?
So it's going to depend on there's different types of zooxanthellae. And so depending on the type of zooxanthellae, and each coral can have a different like abundance of the different types of zooxanthellae. And so whichever one is more dominant or depending on the mix will kind of give them the different colors.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Totally. So that's the zooxanthellae and the corals themselves. So if you think of the reef, what do you think of? You think of like a ton of fish swimming around, you think of turtles, you think of sharks, you think of lobsters, right? So when you think about all of those, think about it kind of like if you were looking at New York City. You see people like bustling around, taxis moving, all of this stuff, but you wouldn't have this city without the buildings. So the corals kind of provide the buildings of the cities of the reef. So they create structural complexity. So that skeleton and all of that hard structure that a coral gives also provides homes for a bunch of the reef fish. It provides nurseries, so safe places for them to lay their eggs. It then turns into a feeding ground for those sharks, for those turtles that are eating smaller animals. Those are the whole reason why you see those really beautiful pictures like you see up here of like bustling life. And this is actually in the Florida Keys. So without corals, you wouldn't have any of that structure and any of the complexity that shows that you have different organisms. So this actually, I wanted to show you how different reef organisms work together. So corals and sponges are different animals, right? So corals are actually in the same family as jellyfish, because if you think about it with those tentacles and those stinging cells, but they work together. So somebody who studies sponges described them as like the mortar that holds the bricks of the reef together. So it's almost like glue that makes the reef kind of stick, especially if you think about the skeleton maybe crumbling. So this sponge is actually growing around some of the coral that we outplanted down here in the Florida Keys. And the sponge is helping secure that coral to the reef, and the coral is helping the sponge grow taller so that it can get bigger and larger. So everything works together down here, you guys. What questions do you guys have just about reefs in general? Yeah.
Were you calling on me?
So I can't see names on here, and I'm so sorry for that. But yeah, I'm calling on you, River.
Okay, so I have a question.
Mhm.
So in a reef, it's only the fish. If there were no fish in a reef, would it still count as a reef, or would it count as like a dead reef?
We'll get there. That's a good question. We'll
Okay.
get there right around why our reefs are in trouble. Maria, what question do you have?
How long does it take a reef to form?
That's another really good question. So for a coral to get to this size, like we were showing you, or to the size where they're going to reproduce and they're going to release those gamete bundles into the water, it can take like 50, 75 years. These guys are really, really slow growing. Well, you're unmuted. What's your other question?
How tall can a coral grow?
How what?
How tall can coral grow?
Oh my gosh, they can grow to be like, Mackenzie, I don't know what like the biggest coral ever is, but when you think about it, so we showed this picture, right? Where you've got like this itty bitty coral that's just like 2 inches. This guy is like 15, 20 feet across down here. So they are like a huge range of sizes. Now I've got to back out. Okay. I see one last hand raised, and then we're going to answer that and then move right along, okay? I'm going to ask you to unmute so you know I'm talking to you.
How old can a coral be its whole life?
So because these guys are, like Mackenzie was talking about, how they're kind of budding and they're just genetically identically copying themselves until they get big, they can live, I mean, hundreds, thousands of years if nothing happens to them. So again, that's something we'll get to with why are reefs in trouble. So other questions we are going to have time for in just a little bit, but we've got a lot of stuff to cover and y'all have really good questions. So I just want to make sure we get all of it. So we're going to move into why reefs are important. So you guys are living in, I heard a lot of Pennsylvanias. So you guys are far, far away from coral reefs, but they are still super duper important to not just me, who I live in the Keys and I work on these reefs and I love them, but to every single person that lives in the world. If you look at this picture right here, this shows where there's tropical reef cover globally. So all of those coastlines, those have coral reefs that are living along them. So why are they important to the people that live there and to us? So first of all, we're going to talk about how the reefs protect us. So just raise your hand. You guys know what hurricanes are. You guys know what tropical storms are. Cyclones, you've heard of all of them, yeah? Okay, so when you think about the Keys, the house that I am sitting in right now and zooming to y'all from, I am half a mile from open ocean. So the coral reef that is along the coastline of the Florida Keys and the coral reefs that are along the coastline of the world in that picture that I just showed you of the map, those reefs are actually breaking up some of the energy from the open ocean waves, and especially in the cases of storms. So a reef crest, where it kind of comes up like this and it's got that structure, it can reduce wave energy. So the energy of the wave that is hitting up the shore, it reduces it by 97%, and it reduces the height of those waves by 84%. So this is a picture of Puerto Rico, in San Juan, Puerto Rico. So this blue line is what it looks like if there's a tropical storm in Puerto Rico now with its coral reef cover. The red line is how far that flooding and that water damage would move in if there wasn't a coral reef to protect it. So these guys are protecting 45,000 miles of coastline worldwide. About 200 million people live in those areas and are protected by those reefs. And these are super important because we can build barriers to break up this wave energy, but coral reefs are constantly rebuilding and repairing themselves. It's super cool. So something else for every single person that corals provide us that you might not already know about is corals actually are a good place for us to research medicine. So because corals are stationary and they're living on the reef and they've got a lot of stuff to contend with that we'll talk about later, they've developed chemical defenses against predators, against temperature fluctuation, against all this stuff that can hit them. So scientists are researching those chemical defenses to help develop drugs that are fighting cancer, that are helping fight infections, that are helping fight, pain and inflammation. Also, a lot of the animals that live on the reef are being used for research like that too. We only know about like 10% of what's living on the reef right now. There's still so much left to learn. So a lot of the medical research in the future is going to be focused on those animals that are living on the reef and the corals themselves. If you guys have ever taken calcium, I know you guys know it comes from milk too, but a lot of calcium in supplements like vitamins you might take actually comes from corals. So the more you know. Something else that you might think about that's really important that corals give us is the blue economy. So worldwide, coral reefs, directly and indirectly, bring in $375 billion. That's billion with a B. It's huge. In the Keys where I live, it's $8 billion. So that is huge for everybody who lives down here, who works down here, who wants to go to a restaurant down here. It's all depending on the reefs. That's for fisheries, like if you want to eat seafood, if you want to go offshore fishing, like take a fishing charter and go deep sea fishing with your friends, if you want to go scuba diving ever, if you like snorkeling, all of that is related to reefs, and that's the blue economy. So worldwide, this is really huge. When you're talking about fisheries and you think about, especially places in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific Ocean, like in Indonesia or in Thailand, fisheries are a huge source of protein for the people that live there. They rely on fish to eat and to live, not just for their economy. So without the coral reefs that are supporting the fish that live on them, a lot of people would be really hungry, malnourished. It would be a huge problem. I'm going to let Mackenzie, zooming out, tell you what your vacation would look like if we didn't have coral reefs.
Yeah, so this kind of directly relates to what Aileen was just talking about, the global economy. So a lot of island places like here in the Keys, Hawaii, French Polynesia are really hot tourist destinations because they have these coral reefs. So a lot of people like to go there to go see those coral reefs and do a lot of water activities. So also the Keys is built on old coral reef skeletons. So if we didn't have those corals, we wouldn't have the Keys in general. And a lot of these businesses and homes down here wouldn't exist. And a lot of people wouldn't be able to live here. So what we like to see is a nice healthy coral reef that's in this bottom right-hand photo that has a lot of different biodiversity. So there's just a lot of different species that are making their homes there on these reefs. And that is what we ultimately would love to see for all of our reefs here. If we didn't have biodiversity and we didn't have a lot of these different species, what we could be seeing is something like in this photo, which basically is just a bunch of jellyfish that are swimming around in the water. So these are going to be some of those animals that if they don't have predators to keep their populations in check, and essentially they can kind of just live for years on end if nothing damages them, that they'll just keep reproducing and then kind of just take over. And then we'll pretty much just have one species that takes over the entire ocean. And we don't want that to happen. Nobody wants to be swimming in the ocean where there's just a bunch of jellyfish around them. So that's kind of how the reefs relate to vacation. And we'll go to the last point is food. So Aileen kind of touched upon this already, but coral reefs actually only cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, but they support about 25% of all marine life. And that it comes in the form of protection, of nurseries, of homes for the fish that will eventually move out into the big blue that our fisheries depend on for our seafood. And so if we look at this photo in the bottom left-hand corner, we have animals that are represented in all the different trophic levels. So the herbivores, the primary producers, primary consumers, and these guys are what a healthy reef should look like. We should have animals from all those different levels. And although we're not in this diagram itself, humans are also a part of that food web. And so if something goes wrong anywhere along those trophic levels, that will eventually come back and we will also feel that. So that is something just to keep in mind, even if you're not living where coral reefs are. And kind of the flip side to being able to grab food from the ocean, we also rely heavily on agriculture. So we get a lot of food from farming on the land. But if we didn't have healthy coral reefs, we'd be turning more to having kind of farms and agriculture. And that would require us to remove a lot more space. And that will lead to pollution. It can lead to more nutrient runoff because we'll be using more fertilizers and things like that. And with the world's ever-growing population, it would just be a really big fight for space. And also the water that we already extract for like drinking water or for powering anything, 70% of that already goes towards providing water for these farms. So if we didn't have coral reefs and we had to expand farms, essentially these problems that we are kind of already facing right now would just get even worse than what they are right now.
All right, you guys. So we've had a couple of questions. Yeah. So how do corals that live in deeper parts of the ocean get enough nutrients to survive? Mac, you want to take that one?
Okay. I know a little bit about deep sea corals. I'm not as familiar with them, but I do know that they don't rely on sunlight, obviously, because they're too far down in the water column. But there's actually a lot of nutrients that settle down in the bottom of the oceans. And so if you think about technically all of our oceans are just one giant ocean in general that are constantly mixing waters all throughout the year, all throughout life. And so as those currents go, they're actually sweeping up nutrients from the bottom and they'll bring it up to the surface. So the bottom water layers are naturally just more abundant in nutrients. So that's kind of how those corals down there will get a lot of their nutrients that they need to survive.
Nice. And then we saw, do sharks destroy coral reefs by accident? So sharks are really big and they're strong and they're powerful, but they are not big enough to just knock into all of the coral on the reef and break it up. A lot of corals naturally, like the ones that you're seeing right here on this kind of main screen, when those guys break off, they'll actually float off into the ocean and find another place to settle, and then they'll grow from there. So no, they don't destroy coral reefs. All right, we're going to take one more in-person question for this section, and we're going to move right along. Maria and sister, I see you. Tell me.
I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
So, one, corals produce their own medicine if they get like a tiny bit sick, or do they have to rely on something else?
So we'll get to that when we talk about why our reefs are in trouble just next. But some of those chemical defenses, they do, just like us, we have natural defenses in our bodies that if we get sick, we can fight off those diseases. It's the same thing for corals, but just like with us, if a disease is really strong, sometimes they need some help.
And also, could corals get, how do corals get their vitamins or something? Like,
So their vitamins and their nutrients, right, that comes 10% from what they catch with their tentacles and 90% from what they get from the sun. So it's just kind of energy, and they'll absorb other nutrients from the water as well.
okay.
All right, you guys. So coral reefs are in trouble, y'all. And I promise I'll get to everybody's questions at the end. Please, from now on, just kind of toss them into the chat and we'll answer them at the end of the section, because I want to explain to you guys all of this really cool stuff. So our reefs are in trouble. Some of you guys may have heard that. Some of you guys might have heard, save the reefs. We need to save the reefs. We are Islamorada Conservation and Restoration Education. So we're trying to restore the reefs. But why do you guys think that is? We'll talk about it. So unfortunately, as of today, 50% of the world's corals have died in the past 30 years. So this is something that's happening really quickly, and it's super sad, but there is hope, you guys. So what's happening, we'll talk about. But in this photo, on the left, you see a happy, healthy, colorful reef. And then on the right, you see that skeleton left over and it's covered by algae. So one of the reasons why a reef will die is bleaching. And Mackenzie will tell you about that.
Yeah, so bleaching is probably something that you guys have all heard. It's very popular in the news, unfortunately. But essentially, bleaching is when the water temperatures increase like 1 or 2 degrees. The corals will realize that something is not working right. So kind of like in us, when we get sick, we have natural responses like we'll try to cough or blow our noses to try to get rid of any of those foreign bodies that might be making us sick. Corals essentially do the same exact thing. So they'll actually start expelling those zooxanthellae into the water columns. And if you look at this graph, we'll see that we know scientists have been tracking the temperatures of the ocean, and they have been rising over the years. And we've had 3 major mass bleaching events happening. So what essentially that is the corals will start expelling those zooxanthellae from their system. And this is where the term bleaching comes into play. So as we had mentioned, the zooxanthellae give corals their color. So if they're losing these zooxanthellae, they're losing all of their color. So in the left-hand part of this photo, you'll see a nice healthy reef. And then not only a couple of months later, you'll see a completely white reef. It's a common misconception that a bleached coral is dead. It is actually not dead. You could zoom in really close to these guys and you'll see a very thin layer of tissue. So the corals can recover from bleaching, but usually the environment doesn't improve enough for them to kind of recover from the stress. So what eventually will most likely happen is you'll see on the very right-hand side of the photo is that these corals will then be covered in algae. And that is what is shown on that right-hand side. Algae grows really fast, and corals, once they die, algae takes over. Yeah, I think that was good. Thanks, Aileen. And then I'll pass it back to Aileen.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, you guys. This is my first time using Prezi. I'm super proud of it, but sorry for the clicking in and out. So, you guys, somebody asked, do corals get sick? So corals do get sick, and they're actually diseases that affect corals. So these are spread from coral to coral. They're spread kind of as currents move water and those disease particles through the water and they reach other corals. Some of these guys are caused by bacteria, like black band disease here, where you see kind of that dead skeleton here and healthy tissue and that black band of disease, or white pox disease, which is basically chicken pox for corals. Some of them are caused by algae overgrowth, like white band disease. So again, here you see that dead skeleton left, and then you see happy, healthy tissue moving in. And one of the other diseases that we are still trying to figure out how it works is stony coral tissue loss disease. And this is a really, really big one in the Florida Keys. So this was first seen in 2014. Science takes kind of a while to figure out how things are going, especially when it's with corals, not with people. So there's not as much like focus on it, right? So in 2014, they first saw this disease, and by 2017, they were really researching it and finding solutions. So how this works is it moves really quickly. They saw this guy in 2017, like January 5th, where just a little bit was dead. 2 weeks later, 20%, and then less than a month later, 60% of that coral was dead. So stony coral tissue loss disease moves fast. And like I said, they're still figuring out how this works. But in the Florida Keys alone, 50% of our reef track has been affected by this, and 60 to 80% of our bouldering corals, so some of the ones that give our reef like a lot of that structure and a lot of that really nice solid stability, have been knocked out by this disease. This picture shows how far and how fast that disease has spread. So just since 2014, it has moved all the way from the Florida Keys through the Caribbean. So that is a disease that affects coral reefs, and then water quality also affects our reef.
Yeah, so many of you guys might know that coral reefs are only about 5 miles off from shore, which is pretty close. And so they are really susceptible to a lot of nutrient runoff, and any pollution or trash that gets into the ocean, it will directly affect our reefs a lot. So one thing that can happen is when there's a lot of nutrients in the water, algae really loves that nutrients. So in the two photos, algae can do two things. In the top right-hand photo, you can see it kind of just makes a layer over the surface. On top, it's almost like a blanket. It's really thick. So that can block out sunlight so that it doesn't reach the zooxanthellae and they can't photosynthesize and produce that energy and food for corals. The other thing algae can do is it can actually directly grow on top of the corals, and it will smother out those polyps, and that will kill them, making more space for the algae to just keep on growing. And then something else that you guys might have heard about a lot is ocean acidification. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner at that little equation diagram thing, we're going to kind of just walk through it really quickly. So we have a lot of carbon dioxide that goes in the air from burning fossil fuels. That's like a lot of the factories and machines and just driving our cars. That puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And our ocean actually absorbs most of that carbon dioxide. And when it mixes with water, it creates carbonic acid. And that carbonic acid will then turn into hydrogen ions, which is why the ocean is considered to becoming more acidic, and then bicarbonate ions. So you could see that that hydrogen ion is kind of lonely, it's by itself. So ultimately what it wants to do is it wants to form another bicarbonate ion. And in order to do that, it's going to be searching out those carbonate ions. And that then is making it harder for corals to use that carbonate to make their calcium carbonate, which is what their skeleton is. So when we have all those hydrogen ions floating around, it's basically taking away the building blocks that corals need to make their own skeleton and grow faster. So they're going to be growing a lot slower when the ocean waters get more acidic. And then predation.
The last thing, yeah, predation. So corals are yummy to some creatures. Now, this wasn't a huge problem in years past, especially in the Keys, where a lot of our corals have been wiped out by that stony coral tissue loss disease, and all over the world where we've lost 50% of our coral cover. Those predators are still out there. So they're kind of congregating, and there's a ton of them on just a few coral heads instead of the ton of them spread out all over the reef. So fireworms will eat coral. They literally just kind of latch onto and suck the tissue off with their little mouths. Snails will eat coral as well. This guy right down here in this yellow circle, super small, but he was really hungry. He ate all of that tissue. And then also ciliates. These guys are teeny tiny invertebrates, kind of in the same family as lobsters and shrimp. But these guys live in the rock that corals kind of grow on top of and secure themselves down to. And they'll move up onto the coral and up all the way up to the top as they're eating that tissue away. So they look like those tiny black dots. So that's predation, you guys. So what I want to ask you guys, and I want y'all to throw your answers into the chat, is what would you guys do and what do you think these things look like? So I'm going to show you guys some pictures and we're going to talk through them pretty quickly of what we're looking at. So first of all, how does this coral colony look to you? First of all, if we're looking right at the bottom, right, it doesn't look like sand and it doesn't look like rock, right? It's covered in algae. But then also look a little closer at the coral. What do those tips look like? Does that look like happy, healthy tissue to y'all? I see a no. Tell me.
No,
River, why do you think?
because those tips are dead tissue.
Those tips
Well,
are dead tissue. Yeah. So, does too much oxygen have to do with them dying? Not necessarily, no. And acidification does sound scary, Mackenzie. It does.
I think that was Duncan.
Just kidding, Duncan. Man, there's too many aliens in this chat. So,
Yeah.
so what we're looking at here in this photo is not a disease, actually. That's predation. So when we were looking at the fireworms earlier, where they kind of put their mouths onto the tips of the coral, that's what we're looking at here. So what we as scientists would do, we would go in and we would just snip those tips off so that the fireworms couldn't reach further down, and then they would happily grow again. So another photo that we're about to look at is this one.
And then really quick to answer the 2 quick questions, any animals that can be affected by ocean acidification are going to be any of the ones that build a shell or have that calcium carbonate skeleton. So it can be urchins, crabs, all those guys are impacted by ocean acidification. And oxygen does actually have to do with coral bleaching, actually, because a byproduct of photosynthesis that the zooxanthellae create is oxygen. So when they're essentially photosynthesizing too much, they're releasing a lot of those extra oxygen radicals that the corals don't like, and they start flipping out because they realize that that is not normal. So that's one of the reasons why they'll start expelling those zooxanthellae from their tissues, because they're having too much oxygen, actually. And then back to the photo though. So now we're looking at this guy. If you look at the bottom, the substrate looks pretty clean. It doesn't look like there's a lot of algae on there. So what do you guys think might be happening? We have some corals that look like they have live tissue. Some of them are really white, kind of looks like as if they were bleached. Maria, if you have an idea, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Or was that a question?
I think it looks like you guys cleaned off the substrate and put the coral there. I'm seeing zip ties from the summer.
I think it looks like it's bleaching.
It looks like that is probably a really good guess, because we can see that the white skeleton is showing. So we can see the calcium carbonate skeleton. That is a good idea. What we are thinking is probably going to be is some form of a disease. So kind of like that rapid tissue loss disease. So if you look at the coral that's kind of towards the middle, you could see that the tips still have some of the tissue on there, and it's also a little bit splotchy. So we consider this to be a type of rapid tissue loss disease.
Those are all really good answers, you guys. Nice.
Yeah.
So those are all things that we were talking about that we would do in those situations. Things that are actually being done too by scientists. A lot of it is happening in the Florida Keys. It's super cool. Mote Marine Laboratory, who me and Mackenzie and Kylie and Mike and Duncan and everybody from I CARE who's here gets to work with, they are just like pioneers and forefront people on coral restoration work. So some of the things that they're doing are they're treating disease. So they're putting antibiotics down onto corals that have disease, just like you would take an antibiotic if you were sick. So they use amoxicillin paste to treat disease. And then they also use epoxy. So just kind of like stuff that'll harden, like you might even use in your bathroom at home to patch up like a leak in your sink or in your tub. They'll use that to block off healthy tissue on a coral so the disease doesn't spread. Something else that we do is we breed corals, and Mackenzie will tell you about that super fast.
So something that most scientists are doing is called assisted sexual reproduction. It sounds really fancy, but essentially it's the same idea as if you're breeding 2 dogs. So if you took one dog that had a favorable trait and another one that had another trait you liked, you breeded them on purpose and they made a puppy with both of those traits. That's essentially the same exact thing that Mote scientists are doing, but with their corals. So Mote has a gene bank of over 1,500 different types of genotypes, which is essentially their expression of DNA. So it will determine whether one coral survives a bleaching event or a disease event. Mote has all of these things written down so they can go when those corals then are sexually reproducing and they're releasing those gametes into the water column. Mote scientists will actually go and bag up those gametes and try to ensure that those fertilize together and hopefully create then essentially like super corals that will withstand a bunch of different diseases or bleaching event and all of that. So that's what they're doing with that. Whoa.
All right, so I unmute myself and we zoom out. So that's what it looks like if a coral is gravid or coral pregnant before they collect those gametes. So what they do after that, and after the corals are bred and when they start growing, is they'll put them back onto the reef with those genes that are going to help support all of those changes in temperature and in disease. So microfragmentation is when they take a diamond saw, scientists do, and they cut up a coral into super tiny pieces. And what this does is it almost resets the coral where it was really big, it was ready to sexually reproduce, it was happy, it was healthy, it was growing, and now it's super small again, and it wants to escape predation, escape disease, escape those threats. So microfragmenting a coral can speed up the growth that it takes to get to that size that we want it to get, where it's reproducing, from 50 to 75 years to 2 years. So super, super, super fast. And what you see here, this can take about 2 months to get from these teeny tiny pieces on the ceramic puck that's like yay big all the way to covering it. So what they do with those after they've grown over that ceramic puck is they'll reskin a coral. So if a coral dies, the skeleton is left over. So scientists will take those pucks with a happy, healthy coral tissue. They'll basically glue it or they'll epoxy it down onto that skeleton and let those polyps grow into the skeleton that's still there. So they don't have to build it themselves. So that 50 to 75 years can take 2 years. And that's how long it takes for a coral to get to this size that you're looking at here on the right. Super, super fast. So it's really cool that they figured that out. Another way that we outplant corals is we'll use nails and zip ties. So that's what we do at iCare. And I'm going to show you guys a quick video about what we do and how we do it. So what you're looking at, if you can hear me, is we take those corals and then we'll use zip ties to put them onto nails down onto the reef. So we all work together down there and it's just super great. We take people from all walks of life. We get all kinds of recreational divers. I'm sorry that you guys couldn't hear the video. That was my bad. But that's how we outplant corals at iCare. So what we're hoping for is for these guys to get big enough where they're reproducing. So if you look here, this is what the corals look like on the day that we outplant them. They're super, super small. They're not really ready to stand up against diseases, but because they've been microfragmented, they're going to grow exponentially faster. So in 2 years, they get to this size and they're creating these homes for the reef fish. They're creating structure, they're creating protection, and they're helping hold that reef together.
And for Emily and Ginger that were part of our camp last year, this is what we did. So we will be doing this again this year.
And we cannot wait to have y'all. So before we get into our last questions, before we sign off, there's some things that you guys can do because obviously these reefs are super important to everybody, not just people who live near them or who live on the coast or even people who want to go snorkeling. So what you guys can do, even just from home, is y'all can conserve energy as best you can. You know, turn off your lights, turn off your faucets when you're not using them, make sure nothing's leaking, recycle wherever you can. We have this picture down at the bottom right of fertilizer because fertilizer is one of the ways that nutrients get into the water and that can help algae bloom. So make sure that you guys, if you guys are fertilizing your own lawns or if your parents involve you in that, try to tell them, try to use organic fertilizer. If you don't, just use whatever's recommended so that it's not going off into the ocean because all drains do lead to the ocean. Online, you guys can always spread the word. You guys can watch films. You can look at informational things. Chasing Coral is a really, really cool documentary on Netflix that has a bunch of information about coral. Reef in Key Largo also has a ton of videos down here. And I'm going to link all of those in the chat so that you guys can maybe read them, look up on them, but also spread the word, you guys, just like these people are doing with posters. You don't need a poster. You just have to tell somebody about this talk that you came to tonight and what you learned and why you think it's important. Thank you guys so much for coming here. I know that we're right at the end of our time, but I want to give you guys time if anybody has questions to put them in the chat or to raise your hand and we'll answer them. But thank you guys again so much for being here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see all of y'all, and then I'm going to share those links. Okay. But yeah, if anybody has questions, somebody put Seaspiracy in the chat. That's another really cool documentary about the ocean on Netflix. Maybe Mackenzie, you can look at some of these other questions that we haven't answered yet while I look at these links.
Somebody asked,